Well, good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the morning plenary session. A couple of short announcements. A reminder, I don't think I was that clear for those of you who were here at the plenary session last night. There's been a paper that's needed to be withdrawn from C1 this afternoon. So Marinus de Jong's paper on the skilled option will not be given. So to adjust for that, the two papers that are listed in your program as part of C3 will be part of C1, and there will be no C3. So that C1 session will meet in the Willow East room at noon. I also want to take a moment to thank again some of the sponsors for the Kuyper Conference, the hosts, obviously Calvin University, Calvin Theological Seminary. The Kuyper Conference is housed at the DeVries Institute for Global Faculty Development. Also, we've received support and happy for the collaboration with the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship, the Nagel Institute for the Study of World Christianity, the Calvin Center for Christian Scholarship, the Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics. The Calvin Institute for Christian Worship is a co-sponsor of this session, and we're pleased to welcome Agnes Chiu, who comes from Hong Kong originally, received her Juris Doctor degree from UCLA School of Law. She combines her experience as an employment law attorney and her doctoral research of China's labor problems using the idea of Kuyper's common grace. She received a PhD degree from Fuller Seminary under Drs. Richard Mao and George Harink. Her research interests include Abraham Kuyper and public theology in the Chinese context. Dr. Chiu is currently the Director of Research and Strategic Initiatives and Director of the Center for Public Theology at China Evangelical Seminary in North America in the Los Angeles area. Please help me welcome Agnes Chiu.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you the situations in China. So before I begin, I do have a disclaimer. The disclaimer is that I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I was never a member of a house church in China. However, my students, they're all Chinese speaking, and we lectured in Mandarin Chinese. And they are house church members who could be currently in the US or currently in China, because we teach via Zoom as well. So the information and research materials in this paper are second-hand or even third-hand sources. However, as most house church members are not able to be here to share their stories, I feel obligated to share with you their struggles and be their voice. If there's anyone in this meeting today who is a house church member in China, I would love to dialogue with you. So that's the disclaimer. What is public theology in China? Public theology may be familiar to Western theologians, yet for many Chinese Christians, public theology might still be unfamiliar to them. This paper uses the term churches because house churches in China are not of the single type. I will briefly explain to you the history of house churches in China and the unique as well as common characteristics among them. These characteristics especially enable them to practice public theology, even though they do not know the term already. Specifically, this paper will address three aspects of public theology and examine how house churches in China, in the practice, and how they respond to the challenges of their daily lives. These three areas are, first, privatization of faith, second, discernment of social issues, and third, relations of the Christian faith and the broader social and cultural context. We'll explore Abraham Kuyper's ecclesiology as discussed as in Rooted and Grounded as a methodology to interpret house churches in China. At the end of this paper, I will use Wuhan's Root and Fruit Church, Wuhan Xiashangtang, a house church, as an example of how a house church in China practices public theology in a restrictive environment. First, a brief history of house churches and their attributes. Christian churches in China can generally be categorized into two groups. First, the three self-churches, which are the government-sanctioned churches. Then there's a second group, the house churches, the illegal churches that are unrecognized by the government and do not enjoy legal status. At the establishment of the Communist China government in 1949, the government kicked out all Western Christian missionaries. During the following decade, in the 1950s, the government forced churches to join the Three Self-Patriotic movement and be regulated by the government. Churches that joined are considered to be the official churches. They are sanctioned by the government. Yet, churches that refuse to submit, they become house churches. They are considered to be illegal, deemed illegal by law, and they are heavily monitored by the government. House churches consider those who yielded to the government coercions to join the Three Self-Church movement as traitors, betraying their loyalty to God, leading to a chasm between the Three Self-Churches and the house churches in China. Afterward, the government began to persecute, arrest, and imprison religious leaders in the 1960s and the 1970s. Leaders such as Wang Mingdao were legendary religious representatives, and the examples of disobedience encourage house church members to insist on disobedience, and their resilience also became the hallmarks of their faith. Exponential growth. Despite persecution, in the 1970s and the 1980s, house churches in China mainly established themselves in the countryside, earning a reputation of mostly uneducated, mostly women, and mostly elderly. This type of house church was grassroots people without much theological training. In the 1990s, taking advantage of the economic takeoff in China, workers migrated to urban cities for employment. A new form of house church emerged, the urban house church, consisted mostly of the grassroots workers from other parts of China. At the same time, another type of house church emerged as well. The economic reforms opened doors to business entrepreneurs from overseas, educated young people from big cities, and also foreign educated elites returning to China, to the major cities in China to start their career. These urban churches usually establish themselves in major cities like Beijing and Shanghai. The growth coincides with a comparatively tolerant political environment towards religions during this time. From the uneducated group to the educated elites, you can tell that house churches expanded in numbers and in types. During this time, the house churches, they hold formal meetings, sometimes even have their own buildings in cities, with the unspoken permission from the government. Beginning in 2000, the winter of persecution happened. Since the 2000s, China's political leadership changed a once tolerant policy and took on a hard-line eradication approach. Gone were the days of permissiveness, and the mere presence of huge house churches concerned the government. Therefore, in 2014, there began the cross-removal movement in China. In various strongholds of Christian strongholds in China, such as the Wenzhou city in the Zhejiang province, there was the cross removal. The government removed crosses from church buildings. It did not matter whether the church building belonged to a government-sanctioned Three Self-Church or a house church. The usual excuse would be architectural violations or building violations. Landlords of house churches were pressured to terminate leases, forcing the house churches to close down. Police officers continuously harassed churches, shutting down meeting places and forcing them to close. One particular example of this type of persecution stood out. Reverend Hao Zhiwei of Ezhou Province in Hubei. She was a pastor trained in the Three Self Church Seminary and once served as a pastor in the Three Self Church in China. When she disagreed with the policy of the government, her church was closed down by the government in 2001. In defiance, Reverend Hao started a house church and continues serving. For 18 years, she served in a house church at the same location. At the height of the persecution in 2019, Reverend Hao was arrested and held without bail for 2.5 years. Just a month and a half ago, in February 2022, Reverend Hao was sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud. Her crime, preached without permission from the government and collecting offerings from the church members. Her sentence is a representation of the hard-line policy. And this type of persecution actually stimulated more resistance from the house church Christians. They even organized death squad, 宣教敢死队, insisting on evangelism despite the risk of arrest and imprisonment. The church was not just under the external persecution. Chinese government also tried to change the religious core values of the belief. The Chinese government is determined to change the core values of Christianity under the disguise of contextualization, 基督教中国化, or sinolization of Christianity. A significant aspect of this contextualization is to subordinate religions under the reign of the Communist Party. The party is supreme, and the church loyalty. In addition, the government passed laws forbidding foreign influences on Chinese churches, seeking to cut off helps from foreign sources. This type of persecutions continue on. Aside from this, Chinese Christians also face challenges in many aspects in practicing the faith publicly. I select 3 areas of public theology in China as their challenges. First, privatization of faith. Second, discernment. And third, relations between faith and the broader society context. First, privatization of faith. Privatization is a well-known issue in a postmodern society. Professor Sebastian Kim of Fuller Theological Seminary wrote in the book Theology in the Public Sphere, referenced Martin Marty's definition. Doing public theology or being a public church is to exhibit its commitment to relate public faith to public order. Let me repeat. Doing public theology or being a public church is to exhibit its commitment to relate private faith to public order. Exhibiting faith publicly is an essential characteristic of public theology. This definition recognizes a theology must be applied to public life issues within a theological framework and being public of one's faith. These characteristics go directly against the tendency of privatizing one's faith. In China, Christians face a multifaceted challenge to counter this privatization. Culturally, Chinese are under the influence of Buddhism, and the Buddhist influence fosters a dualistic worldview. For centuries, the Chinese culture tends to separate the physical world in which they live from the moral and spiritual aspects of their lives. To overcome this dualistic view, Chinese Christians need to fight this tendency and needs to be reminded that God cares about their religious and cares about the physical world, and also mandates the practice of the faith outwardly. Politically, the state seeks to limit the practice of religion within the confines of a physical church building. Outward expressions of religious belief are discouraged, if not prohibited. It takes courage and commitment to display one's faith in public. It might be surprising to us that acknowledging one's Christian identity is not a simple matter for Chinese Christians. To engage public theology, Christians need to be willing to reveal their Christian identity before they apply the faith to the public order. To fight this privatization, it takes a commitment to openly embrace the Christian identity. Second, does China have a public sphere? In fact, some theologians even questioned if there is a public sphere in China. To practice public theology, Christians need to move religion from private to public. And this effort is particularly difficult when the public order is usually out of reach to common people and is traditionally under the control of the state. There is arguably no room for public discussion or impact. Furthermore, when house churches' own legitimacy is at issue, it is even more daunting for house church Christians to go public with their existence or ministry. Whether public theology is legitimate in China demonstrates a lack of consensus among Chinese theologians regarding the definition of public. Some restrict public to only the public domain already dominated or governed by the state. To engage requires permission from the government. When the government does not give the permission, there's no room. Really? And this understanding goes against the understanding of public theology. What is considered to be public in China? I have to say that public is not defined by law, but by the impact on the people. Once again, public is not defined by law, but is defined by the impact it has on the people. Cited Jürgen Habermas in the structure transformation of the public sphere, Professor Kim summarized the characteristics of a public sphere: a sphere between the state and society where individuals are protected from the tyranny of the state. First, there has to be freedom of speech and debate. Second, the sphere involves general public life and issues of general living. Third, the space allows public dialogues with other subjects. Given the governmental restrictions, I have to say the first character of public sphere in China does not exist or is highly restricted. The lack of theological foundation of house churches would also exclude the third character, as house churches generally are incapable of discussions or willing to discuss. So does it mean that there is no public sphere in China? I have to say that the question should be, does the public sphere in China have to have all three characteristics at the same time? I think not. The Christian witnessings can go on even though there is no freedom, even though there is a lack of ability. The witnessing or the practice of faith can occur if there is a willingness to do so. Thus, Chinese churches have chosen the social sphere as the area to practice the faith. How can Chinese Christians apply their Christian faith and provide a normative guidance to others on social issues about topics of their living? They have chosen compassion ministries. To care for the vulnerable in society is the area that Chinese house churches have identified to practice public theology. For example, despite the economic growth in China in the last few decades, core values, beliefs, and ethical relations are lacking in China. People look for guidance, and Christian churches fill the void when the prevailing culture does not provide the needed assistance. Max Stackhouse similarly views the term public as issues affecting people, not necessarily a registration or a license granted by the state. However, some scholars are very critical of this approach of public theology. For example, Pastor Deng Shaoguang and Pastor Xuan Zhiwei in Hong Kong criticized public theology for lacking a theological grounding. They criticized Max Stackhouse' understanding of public theology as focusing too much on the public, without the needed theology, leading to an abstract theology. However, this criticism also faces pushback. Professor Zheng Qingbao argues that theology by nature is public, so it is incorrect to separate theology from its public nature. If all church theology is public, then the criticism of Deng Shaoguang and Xuan Zhiwei is non-existing. Zheng Qingbao also considers the most urgent task for churches today is to participate in the public realm and not waste time arguing about the purity of the theological foundation. Sebastian Kim agrees with this pragmatic approach. To Kim, public theology can motivate different Christian communities to participate in society and bring in the academic aspect as well. In balancing public and theology, Professor She Zhiwei of Tongzhi University in China agrees with the view of Max Stackhouse. Public theology seeks to bring Christians' wisdom into general discussion, to bring forth the flourishing of society. The practical aspect of public theology distinguishes itself from the other form of theological discourses. Thus, if Chinese Christians want to practice public theology, they must overcome the temptation of privatization of the faith. Indeed, they seem to have found a way of practicing this in the daily social issues as the entry point, even though the environment disallowed them to exercise their civil rights and limited space of public discourse. The second issue, the second aspect I would like to discuss is discernment. How can public theology be practical? One needs to be critical in examining social issues and be constructive in suggestions to build a better society. Abraham Kuiper wrote in Rooted and Grounded that the church is both an organism and an institution. Rooted is an organism, a metaphor describing the free life that arises not from human artistry, but immediately from the hand of the Creator, describing the bond that unites people with Christ. Grounded, as an institution, is a metaphor of a house built by the work of human hands on a single foundation, which is the cornerstone of Christ. The metaphor of vital growth of a church overflows into that of the institution, and the metaphor of a building overflows into that of an organism. To Kuiper, this is the law of creation. Every kind of life is created by God, yet human hands brings to light the glory in the creation. The church is rooted in spirituality and grounded in social concerns. The grounded aspect of a church is the institutional, external, public nature of the church. Through the hands of church members, the church cares about society. The church as an institution is a means supplied by God to feed and expand the church, the people of God. Again, this institution that Kuiper refers to does not refer to the official recognition by any state. It refers to the collaborative work, the cooperative work by human hands, to collective participation by its members. Kuiper clearly rejects an outward building as the completion of a church. He stresses on the bond of love that binds the church and the kingdom of God. The organic life of a church is merely the first stage. For humanity to blossom, it takes the power of the institution. Human effort awakens the self-consciousness, analyzes the relations belonging to the family, reflects on society, and ennobles organic life through the institutional power. Whether or not a house church is sanctioned by the government is not the point. What is essential is that the church must pay attention to social concerns, battle against sins, and defend the right of the lower class. Achieving these goals requires shared language to explain and to connect a normative social ethics with society. Stackhouse considers these concrete aspects of public theology in 3 ways: critical discernment, constructive guidance, and understandable language. Critical discernment, constructive guidance, and understandable language. The public realm involves all social spheres: economic, family, politics, cultural, etc. A part of the cultural mandate within the human flourishing is the goal of this public theology. As public theology allows both Christians and non-Christians to understand each other. Kuiper also made it clear that the institution part of a church works formatively upon individuals, structured upon the families, and provides directions upon society. Jürgen Moltmann in God for a Secular Society brings an additional aspect. He characterized public theology as a critical, prophetic, reflective, and reasoned engagement of theology in society for the sake of the poor and marginalized. For the sake of the poor and marginalized. Moltmann brings the focus of social issues, particularly those facing the marginalized. Theology is not just for its own sake going public, but it has to be the voice for the powerless and the vulnerable. So to discern, the church must first have a solid theological foundation. House churches in China are especially vulnerable to cults. Historically, house churches have limited access to theological training. This explains their tradition of relying on medical miracles and mixing folk religions in their beliefs. This handicap makes it difficult for Chinese house church members to discern potential members against their faith. Second, to discern, churches need to examine and determine the current issues impacting society critically. Churches and Christians need to know which segment of society is vulnerable and which aspects of society are unjust. In China, voicing out social problems is a risky business, as the government might consider your voices as criticism and attempts to overthrow the government. Criticism is usually not welcomed or accepted. So for the Christians in China to discern and to voice out is challenging. The third part of public theology, relations between the Christian faith and society at large. Ronald Thiemann, in his book, Constructing a Public Theology, focuses on the pragmatic aspect. What is the difference between a secular social justice advocate and a Christian practicing public theology? Is there a difference? There is. It is the faith that seeks to understand the relations between Christians' convictions and the broader social and cultural context with which the Christian community lives. The relations between the Christian faith and society on various issues requires discovery and discernment. Many Christians in China disconnect their daily living and the Christian faith. Maybe that's true in America as well. An effort to rediscover this connection is not to seek a more public role for theology or the church to empower, but let me repeat it one more time. An effort to discover this connection is not to seek a more significant role for theology, but it is to empower people to see the relevance of God in their daily lives. This involves a two-step process: embracing the Christian identity and also allowing God to be relevant in our decisions. Making God relevant in the decisions is much harder for house church believers in China due to the cultural differences or influence. Yet, there is a growing trend where Christians in China choose to interpret life issues in light of God's commands as tantamount to building this relationship. faith is not separated from society. First, for the identity issue. The Christian identity, for centuries, has been considered to be a Western. Christianity is considered to be a Western religion, Yang Jiao. Since its introduction in the Ming Dynasty in the 7th century, embracing the Christian identity is a significant decision for many Chinese Christians. Despite the cultural obstacles, there has been a change in recent years. Many Chinese Christians are now open to disclosing their Christian identities, indicating their willingness to accept responsibilities associated with this identity. In a 1998 survey conducted among Christians in the Beijing area, 42% indicated that they will be very willing. 24% says that they will be relatively willing. And 32% says that either way, they're okay to disclose their identity. Together, they represent 98% of the Christians surveyed that they are either willing to admit or possibly revealing their Christian identity. Only 2% of the people surveyed will be unwilling to disclose their Christian identity, probably due to their very sensitive governmental positions. Now, we need to be reminded, this survey was conducted in 1998, a time when China had a relative tolerant policy towards religion. And the survey was conducted in Beijing, the capital of China, which the Christians in Beijing tend to be more independent in their thinking. So if the same survey is conducted today, I would imagine the percentage might be lower. The second issue is about is God relevant in our daily decision making? When the question turned to whether the Christian faith is important in their daily living, according to the same 1998 survey, 74% says that they are extremely important. 23% says that is important. Only 2.3% says that is not important. And once again, this survey shows a very positive attitude towards identity acceptance and God's relevance in their lives. However, very interesting, when the survey turns to mission and Christianity, an outward expression, okay, it has a mixed result. 55.8% think that mission and evangelism are very essential, but 40.7% think that they're not necessarily engaged in evangelism. So there's a disconnect. The identity embracement and the thought that they need to engage in mission and evangelism. So the result should be not surprising, because Chinese Christians face a cultural challenge in social participation, whether socially or religiously. Culturally, they are reluctant to engage in public or social participation due to the dualism tension with Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Christians prefer immediate families to the general public, and the status legality as a prerequisite for public theology to many make them hesitant to participate. In order for Chinese Christians to be willing to practice public theology, there also needs to be the mentality of sacrifice, willing to pay the price. The third aspect, although faith is essential, the question remains if faith can provide normative guidance to the society at large. This is the impact on the society, not just within the Christian circles. Theology is not a matter of mere academic recognition, but it involves active participation. According to Sebastian Kim, it is an effort that works to reconfigure the public realm. Kim cited Ninel Cady's Religion, Theology, and American Public Life. The goal is to reconstruct the different issues in public spheres. The goal is to reconstruct the different issues in the public sphere. What does it mean to reconstruct? That is to provide normative teaching on how the public spheres should function. Throughout the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, God was evident in the everyday lives of the Israelites. And the laws given by God is aimed to achieve righteousness. The question is whether Chinese churches leaders can provide the normative teachings to the members and through the members to the society at large. Dialogue is not just discussion, but it encompasses witnessing. House churches include many examples in their witnessing of God's love in their daily lives. They care for the needy. One particular example is that the earthquakes and natural disasters provided opportunities for Christians to practice compassion. And the collective disastrous relief, particularly under various earthquakes in China, gave Christians an extraordinary opportunity to show this love. Christians also realized the civil rights protections for the marginalized and the underprivileged as the call for public engagement. The past modernization activities and thinking process cannot be controlled anymore. Over 94% of the Christians surveyed believe that they should have a positive impact, although they have not done that, but they understand that there is a need, and Christianity is actually making a positive impact on society. So there is an awakening happening among Chinese Christians. Together with the growth of the church, whether the government sanctioned or not, they continue to be a viable force for social engagement. I want to now turn the discussions to the unique nature of house churches in China, why they are suited to practice public theology. Although there's the cultural temptation to privatize the faith, although there's the outward persecution against churches, although they don't have the adequate academic and theological training, they do have the advantage of the size and flexibility in engaging in social issues despite governmental restrictions. Earlier in the panel discussions, I shared about the positive impact of Christian entrepreneurs. Indeed, Christian business owners from overseas, they migrated, they opened up shops and factories in China, and they collaborate with churches in the cities in China, leading to the rapid growth of churches. These Christian business entrepreneurs provide facilities and financial support. And that is one of the reasons why they are growing, together with the partnership with the business owners. However, if you understand the economy in China, the economic downturn in China is happening since the last 10 years. And there's an exodus of business investment away from China to the neighboring countries such as Vietnam and Bangladesh. And that leaves huge unemployment issues in China. So their support and collaboration is uncertain at this time. Another aspect of the house church characteristics is a very strong spiritual role models. Many house church members have been fervent believers for generations. If you talk to any house church members, they will always say that, oh, I'm a third generation Christians, I'm a fourth generation Christians. Why? Because their mothers, parents, their grandparents, they're fervent believers, and they serve as excellent examples of strong spiritual models. These family role models are compelling, especially amid persecutions and sufferings. House churches are also uniquely positioned to engage in public theology because house churches have become the surrogate of families. Now, I talked about the positive role models of family members. At the same time, there's also a breakdown of family units in China. With a huge migration of populations to the cities, the traditional bonding of families in the countryside is broken down. And then these migrant workers, when they are in the cities, what do? They need to look for a sphere where they belong. I mentioned earlier, there's the house church of migrant workers. So churches becomes the surrogate of families. They provide the support, the sense of belonging, and also the the spiritual teaching when there's issues happening to the members' lives. So, in that sense, church has assumed a very powerful role as a family for church members. Fourth, house churches members have a very, very strong prayer life. I remember one time when I was teaching in China, during the days when we were still able to go, I was invited to join the morning prayers. And the morning prayers starts with a alarm, a bell ringing at 5 o'clock in the morning. And then at 5:30, the whole seminary students would gather together in a room, praying for an hour, prostrate position. I have to say that I've never experienced that in America. I doubt it very much Calvin University or even my seminaries. When we have chapel hours, we just sit there very comfortably, sing some songs and have a message. But in China, it's very different. They pray fervently. They pray for an hour. And it was very, very eye-opening for me as a teacher. And so their prayer and the interceding prayers are two hallmark ministries for house churches. The small size also enable the members to have a very close connections among them. The sermons are very practical about the issues that they face every day. And China's issues, the social issues, is compelling. Divorces, breaking down of the family units. The church provides the sound support for them. And therefore, the church is the support that the church members give to each other and also to the society, the people in the community, are powerful, powerful testimony of public theology. One last point about the unique nature of Chinese house churches. Despite the government effort to shut down churches, COVID-19 actually made a valuable change. When the whole country was shut down due to COVID-19 infection, remote meetings and online services changed people's behavior. And that also changed house churches' worship. House churches now began to go to online worship and remote meeting mode. And this change eliminates the need for a physical meeting place. The very same persecution that they suffered in the last 10 years is that they don't need a meeting place anymore, okay? So that is really a positive aspect of the house church in doing public theology because of COVID-19. However, challenges continues to face Chinese churches today. Political tension and persecution will continue. The example of Reverend Hao in Hubei was only an example of persecution that just happened a month and a half ago. As house churches grew in number in the 1990s, they became bolder about their presence, and they demanded legal recognition, legal status, without joining the Three Selves Church movement. Then the government began the wave of shutting down house churches. In 2018, the first one was Zion Church in Beijing, Beijing Shi'an Jiaohui. It was a 100-member church, a small church, but it was closed down in September 2018. Why? Because the church refused to install security cameras in the church building. And so the government could not monitor and recognize who were attending the church. They were shut down. 3 months later, in December 2018, Early Rain Covenant Church in Sichuan, Sichuan Qiu Shengyue Jiaohui, was shut down. The church had 5,000 people meeting each week before it was shut down. The government also arrested its founding pastor, Pastor Wang Yi. In 2020, just 2 years ago, Reverend Wang was sentenced to 9 years in prison for preaching without authorization. But the greatest example of persecution happened to Shouwang Jiaohui in Beijing. Shawang Church was one of the major house churches in Beijing, with over 1,000 members worshiping each week in Beijing. Its founding pastor, Jin Tianmin Mu Shi, is a graduate of Tsinghua University, a Harvard equivalent top university in China. Under his leadership, the church engaged in open services and was bold. It sought to be public about its organized existence. In January 2005, the church actually applied to register with the government and demanded legal status apart from the Three Selves Church system. Neither the Beijing government, city government, nor the National Religious Bureau approved the application. Conflicts between the church and the government ensued from 2005 to 2009, when the church engaged in outdoor worship services as the ultimate act of protest. Eventually, the church service was shut down. In 2011, the government put Reverend Jin under house arrest. Then they took away the leases, and the church resorted to outdoor worships. And finally, in 2019, Beijing Shawang Church was raided by Chinese police and officially banned from gathering to worship because it did not have the government registration. In December 2020, the government finally released Reverend Jin after a 9 years house arrest. He was never charged. He was never tried. Today, the remaining church members of Shawang Church resorted to online worship. During this time of persecution, there are some other theologians would give comments and advice. Professor Paulos Huang of Jilin University reminded churches in China to provide reasonable evidence to support the state and ensure the stability of the government. According to Pastor Wang, churches must address the negative impact of Christianity caused by history, correct these misunderstandings through academic discourses. While this advice seems compelling, it is unlikely that house churches would heed to his advice. Huang's advice resonates with the Chinese government's preference, but ignores the disobedient tradition of house churches. Other theologians offered similar advice. They criticized house churches lack the systematic approach and lacked discernment on social issues. Professor Kaolong Leung Wang Jialin, former president of Alliance Seminary in Hong Kong, wrote an article on house church. He insightfully criticized the overestimation of the Chinese Christian numbers. He added that house churches are not one unified body, but are diverse in their characteristics and backgrounds. Their overall theological foundation is weak. The spiritual foundation is superficial, and the theological analytical skills are inadequate. Leung estimated that it would take 2 generations before China churches can make a far-reaching exemplar or theological contribution. Leung further concluded that the utmost urgent task ahead of China churches were to set up their organizational infrastructure, drive out cults, and clarify their theological standpoints. They need to adjust their spiritual traditions. I assume Leung is referring to the reliance on medical miracles and tongue speaking. Leung said that they need to build an ethical world to respond to the challenge of a shrinking society. Finally, very importantly, Leung said that they need to establish a more reasonable and practical relationship with the state and fight for religious freedom. They need to establish a more reasonable and practical relationship with the state and fight for freedom of religion. Leung's advice is similar to that of Professor Huang in Jilin University. In short, he warned against the unrealistic goal of thinking the Chinese churches can finish their last baton in evangelizing to the world. I have to say that Professor Leung's criticism on the status of Chinese churches is accurate. Without sufficient access to systematic theological training, churches are unprepared to tackle the new challenges of a changing society, it is even more unlikely that they can participate and shape the future of society using Christian values. Leung was also correct to warn against the self-serving goals of exaggerations in the number of Chinese Christians. Yet, his step-by-step approach involves many issues and factors that are interlocking and are beyond the house church's control. Should the church wait for these changes, especially political tolerance? This article was written 14 years ago, in 2008. 14 years have gone by. Political pressure in China did not decrease, but increased. Is this patriotic rationale truly the pathway for China house churches? I wonder. I wonder what would Abraham Kuyper say to the house churches in China in 2022? In Rooted and Grounded, Abraham Kuyper warned against the zeal to make converts, but postponing the instructions of the converts. He called it untenable. For a few years, there has been much cheers on the growth of Chinese Christians' numbers in China. Yet, these new converts lack the foundation instructions, the discipleship. The churches in China need pruning and discipline. They need the institution to work on their individual faith and to give guidance. I have to say, the persecution that the Chinese churches face today works as a refining fire. It seeks to refine the church as an actual organism, as Kuiper would characterize. The church is an organism because it lives according to its own rules and must follow its vital law. The church is rooted in the eternal election and love. In this eternal field, Kuiper says that the organism of the church sends forth its roots. From this eternal, it draws its life-giving sap, and under the rays of this eternal, it flourishes. Neither the arrest of its leaders or the shutting down of the meeting places can stop this growth. If the house churches remained rooted in the eternal promise and the love of Christ, I believe they will continue to blossom. A Voice in the Wilderness, a case study of the Wuhan Root and Fruit Church. Finally, we turn to the house church that practices public theology. I choose Wuhan because Wuhan was the ground zero of COVID-19. Wuhan Root and Fruit Church, 武汉下上堂教会. Its founding pastor, Pastor Job Huang, Wang Lei, led the church to participate in public affairs. As early as 2016, he focused on the social participation and social care. On July 30th, 2016, Reverend Huang organized a symposium titled Religion and Law International Academic Symposium, 宗教与法治国际学术研讨会. Reverend Wang first got involved in social engagement after the 2008 earthquake. Remember, I talked about the earthquake, the natural disasters, as the opportunities for Chinese churches to get involved. In 2008, the earthquake in Sichuan was huge. He organized house churches and began a compassionate ministries to aid the earthquake victims. A medical orthopedist by training, Reverend Huang spent 3 years in the devastated area in Sichuan to help the victims. To Reverend Huang, the Bible mandates a social engagement and compassion on social issues. He quoted Proverbs 19:17 repeatedly. Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. This verse commands believers to show God's love through caring for the victims' physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. During the tolerance religion policy time period, the local government also worked with Reverend Wang, also worked with Christians. The Christian's assistant helps local governments to have a favorable report on their relief effort. Believe it or not, the government has a favorable report on the relief effort. Aside from natural disasters, The Root and Fruit Church also organized food banks to distribute food to the poor. They work with the government agency that governs Minzhengju. The government provided a list of families who needed help, and the churches provided the items. In 2015, this particular food bank officially registered as an NGO and was even awarded the Outstanding Nonprofit Organization. Of course, this is still happening during the time when the policy was kind of tolerant. And I have to add that if you understand China will have a policy from the central government. But how do you implement the policy will very much depend on the local government. And the local government has a need to report to the central government that they're doing good work. And so there is a room and space that provides by the local governments to allow churches to work, to practice public theology. Aside from that, Reverend Wang even managed to organize the donation of blood to other Chinese members in society. In 2012, the churches organized a blood drive. Subsequently, year by year, city by city, church by church, over 6,000 people donated blood. Now, we should understand, donation of blood is not something that the Chinese would do, because blood is very precious to the Chinese. And so it is not our custom to donate blood. So for them to encourage members to donate blood is significant. He even managed to dedicate November 25th of each year as the blood donation date. It is amazing as we continue. He wanted to have a prison ministry to minister to those inmates, adoption agencies to minister to the orphans, to have orphanages for the disabled and elderly. As we go on, I think you can see why I picked Wuhan's Root and Fruit Church and why I picked Reverend Wang. This church is an example of how a house church can actively engage its faith in compassionate ministries. Now, their excellent work is usually without reporting. Why? Because they're illegal. They are not legal. However, they continued. Although the voice in the wilderness is faint, that voice is persistent. Even during the time when the government was shutting down house churches left and right, the COVID-19 pandemic gave an opportunity. Now, I mentioned earlier, Wuhan was ground zero for COVID-19. That was the first city that was being shut down during the pandemic. When all people were fearful of COVID-19, they were fearful of infection. They did not know they do not know what can be done about this infection. There was no vaccine available. What did the church do? Reverend Wang organized his members, the church members, to distribute masks, to organize visitation teams, to transport the infected to hospitals, to distribute resources to the communities. The church was on the verge of being shut down, not just from the government, but also from the pandemic, but they continue with the brave and compassionate ministry in the pandemic. Amazingly, the local government of Wuhan also praised the work of the Root and Fruit Church in the effort in providing help during COVID-19. And even some policemen agreed that the city needed prayers. Isn't it amazing? Many people have warned Reverend Wang to leave China because the fear of persecution and arrest. But he has chosen to stay. He has chosen to lead his congregation. I'm afraid that that risk is very real, the risk of persecution and arrest. But I am amazed by his example. To sum up the pros and cons and challenges house churches face in practicing public theology, the challenges will remain. You can see that the house churches is very pastor-oriented, and they lack a system. If you have a pastor who is very motivated and connected and convicted on practicing public theology like Reverend Wong, then the whole church would follow. But Reverend Wong is an exception. The lack of strong leaders is something that the Chinese churches would have to face. The second, lacking in theological training. The government continues to crack down on different groups' efforts in training. In the past, there have been a lot of resources from foreign organizations, seminaries to help out to train. However, I have to say that COVID-19 opened the doors. The seminary that I teach in, we engage in online teaching. We teach in Mandarin Chinese. We teach students in China. And with that, no one can stop us. And so I would say that this is a new way of learning, not just for seminaries in North America or in the world, but also particularly in seminaries or for churches leaders that are living in restrictive environment. I think the challenge for us is to figure out what can we do to provide the help. What kind of teaching that we can provide the tools for them to engage, to learn. Persecution will continue. The government is increasingly suspicious of house churches' activities. Just as I prepare for this presentation, house churches that engage in the online worship service, when only 2 or 3 people are organizing the online service, they are raided as well. They're being arrested as well. So the risk is real. In conclusion, we have examined many challenges Chinese house churches face in their survival, mainly from the state and the intolerant policy. Yet, we have also examined the unique nature of house churches in living out the faith as a body rooted in the eternal promise and love for each other, as an institution that affirms the human participation in building up the church body. The institution of Kuiper refers to is not an external, legitimate license or a building. Yes, the church buildings can be confiscated, outward meetings can be shut down, and ministers can be arrested and imprisoned. All these persecutions can only attack the external aspects. The questions that remain for house churches in China is, first, whether they can remain rooted in the solid foundation of love and Jesus' eternal promises. If so, they can grow. Second, whether they can be grounded in the institution, that is, the collaborative work of its members in caring and continuing living out the faith as a body, as one body, despite threats of imprisonment and persecution. Borrowing the words of Abraham Kuyper, he says, therefore, our church must again become not merely Christians, not merely Protestants, but reformed. God is her sovereign. The eternal election is the heart blood of her eternal life, and God's word, the foundation that cannot be dislodged, upon which she stands with both her feet. It is not the name of the denomination, but is the heart of the Reformed tradition, in full submission to God's sovereignty, in convictions of being elected, and in the dedication to studying God's word. For Christians outside of China, what can we do to help our brothers and sisters in China to remain faithful to the call? We can help in the institution as a collective body of Christ, teaching and building them up in the Word of God. Maybe through online teaching, maybe through translation of valuable resources into Chinese. And this is why the instruction in Chinese is so crucial and translation of resources into Chinese so essential. We need to give them the tools. For Chinese house churches, they will survive the wave of attacks. This will be a refining process for them to strengthen their faith. They may not know the terminology of a developed theology or public theology, but the faith is vivid, and the daily lives and existence attest to the willingness to practice public theology. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you so much for your prayers for Chinese churches. Thank you.